The story begins not with a roar of cannons or the glory of kings, but with the quiet hum of everyday life, the kind of life that most history books pass over. Imagine a small colonial settlement along the coast of New England in the early 1700s. It was not Boston or Philadelphia, not even a town famous enough to be remembered, but one of those countless tiny hamlets where people rose with the sun and worked until it fell, building their lives board by board, field by field. The houses were wooden, their walls thin against the bitter winter winds that swept from the Atlantic. Children would crowd together under quilts stitched by their mothers, listening to the creak of the timbers as storms pressed against the shutters. Most families had only a single room where everyone ate, worked, and slept. There was no grandeur here, no drama of powerful men giving speeches, only the sound of axes splitting firewood and the rhythm of waves breaking against rocky shores. Daily life was defined by repetition. Men spent their days cutting timber, mending fences, repairing tools. Women tended the hearth, spun wool into yarn, preserved what food they could so it would last through the long months when the earth yielded nothing. Children gathered kindling, hauled water from the well, and helped with chores as soon as they were old enough to stand without wobbling. The monotony was unbroken except by Sunday services, where the community crowded into a drafty wooden church, their voices carrying old psalms through the cold morning air. It is easy to romanticize the past, to imagine it filled with adventure. But for most people, it was exactly this: a cycle of labor, hunger, and fleeting moments of relief. A farmer might plant his field and watch his crops vanish in a late frost. A fisherman might spend an entire day on the water, returning home with little more than enough to feed his family that night. In the evenings, when candles burned low, they would gather around the hearth and listen to stories not of heroes but of neighbors. The gossip of who traded with whom, who owed debts, who was expecting another child. And yet, even in this monotony, history lived. Every nail driven into timber, every seed planted, every weary hand pressed into the soil built the foundation for something larger. We remember great battles and revolutions, but without these anonymous lives, there would have been no armies to march, no cities to rise, no nations to claim their place. These small towns were the skeleton of America, and the people who lived in them rarely knew they were shaping the future. The winters were the hardest, snow piled high against doorways, sometimes sealing families inside for days. Food stores dwindled quickly, and rationing became a grim habit. A child might wake in the middle of the night to the sound of the wind howling through gaps in the walls, wondering whether there would be enough bread by the week's end. Neighbors looked after one another not out of kindness alone, but necessity. When one barn collapsed under snow, others came with tools and shoulders to lift beams back into place, because if one family fell, the entire village grew weaker. Trade routes connected even these forgotten settlements to the wider world. Ships sailed from Boston and New York, carrying rum, molasses, and manufactured goods from across the ocean. A villager might never leave the colony, yet he might sip tea from China or wear cloth dyed in colors produced in Europe. Every object held a hidden story of distant lands, though few paused to think about it as they went about their chores. The passage of time was marked not by grand events, but by the steady rhythm of seasons. Spring thawed the frozen ground, filling streams and rivers until they overflowed. Fields were planted, sheep were sheared, and fishing boats returned to the sea. Summer brought long days of work and heat that left men drenched in sweat and women seeking shade under the edges of their small homes. Autumn meant harvest, the storing of grain and salted fish, the last hope to fill cellars before the cruel months returned. Winter was survival, always survival. Illness was a constant shadow. Fevers swept through the town without warning, carrying away the very young and the very old. There were no hospitals here, No doctors beyond the knowledge of herbs passed down through generations. A mother might press a poultice of roots and leaves to a child's skin, whispering prayers while hoping the sickness would break before morning. Graves dotted the edges of every settlement, silent reminders that life was as fragile as the thin walls of their cabins. There were, of course, small joys. The laughter of children tumbling in the fields when the work was light, the warmth of bread baked fresh from an outdoor oven, the rare gatherings when neighbors came together to share a meal, their voices rising in songs that echoed into the night. These moments did not make the history books, but they carried people through. Without them, the endless labor would have been unbearable. It is tempting to skip ahead to wars, to revolutions, to the fiery speeches that reshaped nations. But before any of that, there was this: the long silence of ordinary lives lived in obscurity. And if you lean close enough, you can almost hear them still. The scrape of shovels against frozen earth, the soft murmur of prayers in candlelight, the creak of rocking chairs as old men watched another season pass. This is where the story begins. Not with the powerful, but with the invisible, those who never saw their names etched into stone, yet built the world piece by piece. Their history may seem boring, uneventful, even dull, but without it, there would be no grand story to tell. If the first part of this history is about the rhythm of ordinary life in a small colonial town, then the second part is about the way that rhythm began to shift, slowly and quietly, as the colonies themselves changed. Nothing happened overnight, and there were no sudden fireworks to announce a transformation. Instead, life altered like the turning of a season, so gradually that most people did not even realize it until they looked back years later. The colonies were growing. What had once been scattered hamlets of wooden shacks and half-cleared fields were now expanding into towns with proper roads, markets, taverns, and small industries. More ships came into the harbors, more merchants brought goods, and more people arrived from across the Atlantic. With every arrival, the villages gained new customs, new ideas, and new tensions. The faces in the church pews no longer all belonged to neighbors who had known each other since childhood. Some were strangers, immigrants from Scotland, Ireland, Germany, or other parts of Europe, each bringing with them a language and a way of life that did not always fit neatly into what had come before. This expansion was not just physical. The flow of goods and people brought new ideas, even in places where literacy was rare. Pamphlets circulated, sermons were copied, and travelers carried stories from distant cities. A farmer in a small village might never leave his colony, yet through the gossip of merchants he would hear of riots in Boston, debates in Philadelphia, or new laws passed by the British Crown. These stories spread slowly, passed mouth to mouth like embers carried in the wind, but they were enough to plant questions in the minds of people who otherwise lived uneventful lives. At the same time, the daily grind continued. Families still struggled to survive each winter, still feared disease, still worked from sunrise to sunset just to keep food on the table. But beneath that monotony, change was brewing. For one thing, the economy of the colonies was shifting. No longer were people simply farming for survival. Many began to grow crops not just for themselves, but for trade. Tobacco, rice, indigo, and later cotton began to flow out of the southern colonies, while timber, fish, and livestock moved northward and across the ocean. Even the most remote families could not entirely avoid the pull of trade, for what they wore, drank, or used often came from far away. Yet along with trade came debt. A man might borrow money to buy tools, seed, or livestock, hoping that the next harvest would pay it back. If the weather failed or markets shifted, he would be left with nothing but bills he could not pay. Tensions grew not only between rich and poor, but between the colonies and the merchants and authorities who profited from their labor. Many people who lived what seemed like boring, repetitive lives carried invisible burdens of worry. Worries about whether they would ever escape poverty, or whether their children would have anything more than they themselves had been given. Religion was another force shaping the colonies. In the early 1700s, most villages clung to strict religious practices. Sunday sermons could last hours, warning of sin, damnation, and the need for obedience. For many, faith was the only comfort in a world where death came suddenly and often. But over time, even religion began to change. Traveling preachers arrived, stirring excitement with fiery words that broke from the old traditions. This movement, later remembered as the Great Awakening, drew crowds from farms and villages, filling fields with people who wept, prayed, and sang. For those who had lived lives of quiet repetition, these gatherings felt like a thunderclap, a moment when the ordinary was briefly lifted into something extraordinary. Still, for all the noise, most days remained uneventful. People woke, worked, ate, and slept, unaware that their routines were part of a much larger story. And that story was beginning to feel the weight of the British Empire more heavily. New taxes, new regulations, and new restrictions arrived in the form of laws written by men thousands of miles away in London. A farmer might not understand the details of imperial politics, but he understood when his goods cost more, when his paper came stamped with fees, or when his neighbor complained that the price of molasses had doubled. These were small annoyances at first, but they piled up, like snow building on a roof until the beams began to groan. The social fabric of the colonies was also becoming more complex. In many towns, there was now a clearer line between those who had wealth and those who did not. Merchants, lawyers, and landowners began to dominate local politics, while laborers, sailors, and farmers remained voiceless. Resentment brewed quietly, though it rarely erupted. In taverns at night, after mugs of ale loosened tongues, one might hear men mutter about unfairness, about distant rulers, about how they bore the weight while others took the profit. But by the next morning, most would return to their fields or ships, repeating the same cycle. Slavery was also becoming an undeniable part of the colonies. In the South, enslaved Africans were forced to labor in vast fields, their sweat and lives fueling the economy. Even in the North, where the scale was smaller, slavery was present. Many colonists ignored or justified it, seeing it as just another part of the system that allowed their society to function. But beneath the surface, the contradictions were already there. How could a people speak of freedom and opportunity while denying it to others? For now, it was a quiet hypocrisy, but one that would eventually erupt. The natural environment shaped everything. Forests still covered much of the land, and clearing them was a constant task. Rivers provided both power and danger, flooding fields in the spring and carrying goods to markets in the summer. The wilderness was never far away, and with it came fears of wolves, of bears, and of conflict with native peoples who resisted the steady spread of settlers. These tensions were not always constant, but they lingered, flaring into violence when land and survival collided. As years passed, generations began to turn over. The children who had once listened to their parents' stories by the fire grew into adults with their own children to feed. They inherited the same fields, the same tools, often the same worries, but they also inherited a slightly changed world, one with more trade, more diversity, more whispers of discontent. The slow shift of history could be felt most in the way people thought about themselves. They were still colonists, subjects of the British Crown, but more and more, they began to think of themselves as something else too, as Americans, even if they did not yet have the word for it. And so, in these decades before great revolutions, life in the colonies was still marked by the ordinary. People rose, worked, and slept, their days filled with chores and their nights with small comforts. But beneath that surface, cracks were forming. Change was coming, though few could see it clearly. Like the faint rumble of thunder beyond the horizon, it was distant, but it was moving closer. The story remains boring on the surface, because history often looks that way when lived in real time. There were no grand speeches yet, no battles, no declarations. There were only ordinary people, plowing fields, mending clothes, building houses, singing hymns, sharing gossip, yet carrying within their lives the seeds of something that would transform not only their villages, but the world. The colonies, by the middle of the 18th century, had grown into something far larger and more complex than the scattered settlements of the previous century. By now, bustling port cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston were alive with the sound of ships creaking in their docks, barrels rolling across planks, and merchants calling out prices in crowded marketplaces. The story, however, does not simply belong to those cities. It still belongs to the ordinary men and women whose lives, though often dull and repetitive, carried the weight of history forward. In the countryside, the rhythm of farming continued unchanged. A farmer would wake before dawn, his breath visible in the cold morning air, and lead his oxen into the fields. Wooden plows scraped the soil, rough hands scattered seed, and sweat dripped into the earth. At harvest, the entire family worked together, carrying sheaves of wheat or corn into barns. There was little romance in it. Farming was a cycle of exhaustion, dictated by weather and luck. Crops could flourish one year and wither the next, and no amount of effort could guarantee success. Yet this cycle supported the colony's survival, feeding not only families, but also the growing cities that demanded more food with each passing year. The small towns that had once seemed isolated now felt the pull of larger colonial society. Taverns became gathering places not only for drink, but for the exchange of news. A man traveling from Boston might stop in a rural tavern and share word of protests over taxes, while a sailor might bring gossip from the Caribbean about wars between empires. To most villagers, these stories seemed distant, little more than background noise to their own lives. Yet, these scraps of news were like seeds, planted quietly in minds that would one day question their place in the empire. The British presence was more visible now. Red-coated soldiers patrolled certain towns, not always in large numbers, but enough to be noticed. They were reminders that the colonies were not free to govern themselves fully, that every decision ultimately flowed from London. For many colonists, the soldiers were little more than a nuisance, men who took up lodging, consumed supplies, and occasionally quarreled with locals in the streets. But the very sight of them was a symbol, an unspoken reminder that their freedom was limited. Taxes and trade regulations began to cut deeper into everyday life. The Navigation Acts required colonists to trade only with Britain, stifling the chance to find better prices elsewhere. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and other measures meant that even ordinary goods carried an extra cost. A farmer buying a newspaper, a merchant importing cloth, or a lawyer drafting documents, all felt the pinch. The discontent was not yet open rebellion, but it simmered in the background like an ember waiting for air. For the common people, these issues rarely appeared as politics. They appeared as smaller frustrations, the cost of tea climbing too high, the inability to sell goods for fair value, the irritation of seeing wealth flow into the hands of distant rulers. In markets and on street corners, one might overhear quiet complaints. Why should we pay more when we see nothing in return? These conversations rarely ended in action, but they planted the early roots of resentment. Amidst this, daily life still carried on. Women rose each morning to tend hearths, bake bread, and spin wool. Children studied letters if their families could afford schooling, but more often they learned practical skills: how to farm, how to sew, how to handle tools. Communities gathered for barn raisings, for church services, for funerals that came all too often when disease swept through. Smallpox, in particular, haunted the colonies. An outbreak could reduce a town to silence, with homes shuttered and church bells tolling endlessly. Death was not unusual. It was expected. Every family had lost someone, and each grave dug in frozen soil reminded them of life's fragility. Religion continued to stir passions. Preachers traveling from town to town filled fields with crowds. Their fiery words about sin and redemption thrilled some and disturbed others. Old church leaders grumbled that tradition was being undermined, but ordinary people often welcomed the excitement. For many who had spent their lives in quiet obscurity, these gatherings felt like a rare moment of being part of something larger. They did not know it, but the same yearning for renewal and change that filled these religious revivals would later fuel political upheaval. Slavery, by now, was woven deeply into colonial society. Ships carried enslaved Africans across the ocean, unloading them at southern ports where they were sold into lives of forced labor. The fields of tobacco, rice, and indigo depended on their toil. Even in the northern colonies, enslaved labor existed, though on a smaller scale. For most white colonists, this was simply the way things were, an accepted reality. Few questioned it openly, though the contradiction between their own growing talk of liberty and the denial of liberty to others was becoming harder to ignore. The hypocrisy lay buried beneath daily necessity. But one day it would split open. The environment, too, shaped every decision. Vast forests still stretched across much of the land, and clearing them required back-breaking labor. Rivers provided lifelines, carrying goods to markets, but they also flooded, destroying homes and fields in violent bursts. Winters were still cruel, summers humid and exhausting, storms unpredictable. Nature remained an adversary as much as a resource, a constant reminder that survival depended not only on human effort, but on forces beyond control. As the colonies entered the 1750s and 1760s, tensions with European rivals spilled over into North America. The French and Indian War brought violence to frontiers, where settlers lived in fear of raids and skirmishes. For many colonists, this was their first taste of a larger conflict that touched their lives directly. Men were called to fight, often leaving families behind to fend for themselves. Taxes rose again to fund the war effort. The war ended with Britain victorious, but victory came with debt, and that debt would soon be demanded from the colonies. Ordinary people did not speak in terms of empires and debts. They spoke of higher prices, of shortages, of more soldiers stationed nearby. Yet every frustration, every tax, every argument in a tavern was another thread woven into a growing fabric of discontent. Life still looked boring on the surface. Farmers plowing, women cooking, children playing. But the background noise was changing. What had once been quiet obedience was turning into quiet defiance. Generations had now passed since the first wooden cabins were raised on the rocky shores of New England. The grandchildren of those settlers were no longer just colonists. They were people of this land, tied to its soil, shaped by its hardships, and increasingly aware that they were different from those who ruled them. They still sang old songs, still prayed old prayers, but they also began to ask new questions. What right did a king across the ocean have to dictate their lives? Why should they pay for wars they did not start? And if they worked this land with their own hands, why did they not fully own their own destiny? For now, these questions remained whispers, carried in conversations between neighbors, muttered after long days of labor, spoken more boldly in cities where pamphlets circulated. But whispers have a way of growing louder. The boredom of daily life, of fields, hearths, markets, and prayers, was about to collide with something greater. The ordinary, invisible lives of farmers, merchants, and laborers were about to become the beating heart of history. Because the colonies, though they did not know it yet, were standing on the edge of transformation. The dull rhythm of survival was giving way to a new rhythm, the pulse of discontent, the stirrings of rebellion, the first breath of a nation that had not yet been born. By the late 1760s and into the 1770s, life in the colonies looked much the same as it had for generations. A farmer still rose before dawn to harness his oxen. A woman still spun wool into thread, kneaded dough into bread, and prayed quietly for her children's health. Children still fetched water, carried wood, and chased one another through fields when the chores allowed. On the surface, it was the same repetitive cycle of work, sleep, and survival that had always defined colonial life. Yet beneath that surface, something different stirred. The air seemed heavier, the conversations sharper, the once quiet frustrations now rising into words that carried further than before. The turning point for many ordinary people was not a single law or event, but the steady accumulation of grievances. Taxes and regulations came one after another. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act. To a wealthy merchant, these meant calculations, profit lost, or prices raised. To a farmer or tradesman, they meant fewer coins left in his pocket after long days of labor. What had once been irritation was now resentment, and resentment has a way of spreading like cracks through ice. Taverns became hotbeds of discussion. By candlelight, with mugs of ale or rum in hand, men spoke in low voices about their anger toward Britain. Some read aloud from newspapers and pamphlets, their voices filling the smoky air with words that seemed almost dangerous. Liberty, rights, resistance. Names like Samuel Adams and John Hancock began to appear more often, not as distant figures, but as men who spoke what others dared only whisper. Still, most returned home quietly afterward, rising the next morning to resume the endless chores of survival. Yet, the seed had been planted, and seeds have a way of breaking through even the hardest soil. For women, the change appeared in subtler ways. They organized spinning bees, gatherings where they wove homespun cloth as an act of quiet defiance against British imports. To outsiders, it may have looked like a group of women working at wheels and looms, chatting and laughing. But in truth, it was political action, a refusal to rely on goods taxed by Britain. In kitchens, too, resistance brewed. Families drank Liberty tea, made from local herbs rather than taxed imports. Every small decision, what to wear, what to eat, what to buy, was suddenly more than a personal choice. It was a statement. Children heard their parents argue in hushed tones at the hearth. They overheard talk of boycotts, protests, and British soldiers. Some played games pretending to be redcoats and rebels, imitating the marches and shouts they saw in the streets. They did not yet understand the weight of what was happening, but they absorbed it. History was not just written in declarations and speeches. It seeped into the next generation through stories, whispers, and even play. In the cities, tension was visible. Red-coated soldiers patrolled the streets of Boston, a constant reminder of authority. Colonists glared as they passed, muttering insults under their breath. Skirmishes broke out, sometimes small, sometimes deadly. The Boston Massacre of 1770 was one such flashpoint, when what began as a street quarrel turned into blood on the cobblestones. For villagers reading about it days later, the event seemed both shocking and distant. 5 men dead, they said, shaking their heads, then turned back to their fields. But the story did not fade. It spread, carried on horseback, printed in pamphlets, retold in taverns. It became a symbol that even the most ordinary farmer or tradesman could not ignore. And then came the Tea Act, and the response that followed in December of 1773, the Boston Tea Party. Colonists, disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded ships and hurled chests of tea into the harbor. It was an act as much symbolic as practical, a direct insult to British authority. News of the protest traveled like wildfire. In small towns far from Boston, men and women spoke of it with awe. Some smiled proudly, others feared what might follow. But no one could deny that the mood was changing. The British response, the so-called coercive acts, only deepened the divide. In Boston, the harbor was closed until the tea was paid for. Soldiers occupied the city in greater numbers. For colonists living hundreds of miles away, this seemed at first a problem belonging to Boston alone. But slowly, the realization spread. If Britain could punish one colony so harshly, none were safe. What happened in Boston today could happen anywhere tomorrow. Yet still, daily life continued. Fields had to be planted. Bread had to be baked. Children had to be clothed. The boredom of existence did not vanish simply because politics grew louder. Even in the shadow of rebellion, the smell of wood smoke drifted from chimneys. The creak of rocking chairs echoed on porches, and the sound of hammers striking nails filled the air as barns were built and repaired. But now, layered atop that monotony was a sense of expectation, as though everyone sensed that life as they knew it was poised to shift. The First Continental Congress met in 1774, drawing leaders from across the colonies. For ordinary people, this was not an event they witnessed directly. They were not present in the halls where men argued about rights and independence, but they felt its effects. Pamphlets and letters carried the debates outward. Boycotts were organized, petitions signed, militias quietly prepared. In villages, groups of men began drilling with muskets in fields after their chores were done. At first, it seemed almost theatrical, farmers practicing military maneuvers in muddy boots. But as the weeks passed, the practice grew more serious. The dull rhythm of farming days now held an undertone of preparation. Religion once again played its part. Ministers preached sermons that tied scripture to politics, declaring that resistance to tyranny was a sacred duty. Congregations, gathered in their drafty wooden churches, heard not only of heaven and sin, but of liberty and justice. Faith became fused with politics, giving rebellion a moral weight that carried into the hearts of even the most ordinary farmers and craftsmen. The winter of 1774-1775 was one of tension. Rumors spread constantly that British troops would march on towns, that more taxes were coming, that leaders would be arrested. Some rumors were false, others true, but all of them kept people on edge. In homes lit only by firelight, families whispered of what might happen. Would there be war? Would Britain crush them? Would life ever be the same? And then came April 1775. The quiet monotony shattered with the crack of musket fire at Lexington and Concord. Farmers, who had once only tended fields, now stood armed against soldiers of the most powerful empire in the world. The shots that echoed across those green fields were heard in every colony, even if only as stories carried days later. For those who lived far away, it felt unreal. How could their neighbors, men who only yesterday were plowing soil, now be soldiers? But it was real. History had shifted. For the first time, the ordinary boredom of colonial life was pierced by something extraordinary. Revolution. The people who had lived in quiet obscurity, their names unknown to history, suddenly found themselves swept into events that would shape nations. Their lives of farming, fishing, spinning, and praying had not prepared them for this, yet they rose all the same. And so, what had been boring history, the endless cycle of work and survival, now stood on the edge of transformation. The years of monotony, the small grievances, the quiet frustrations had built to this moment. The colonies, once scattered and obedient, were awakening. The dull murmur of taverns, the hushed whispers at hearths, the sermons in churches, all were gathering into a roar that could no longer be ignored. The revolution had not yet fully begun, but the colonies were no longer what they had been. The boredom of yesterday had given birth to the turmoil of tomorrow. And from that turmoil, something entirely new was about to emerge. The years crept forward like the slow flow of a river in winter, heavy and inevitable. By the mid-1700s, life in the colonies was still marked by its monotony, though threads of change were weaving themselves into the fabric of daily existence. The towns had grown, some larger, some simply more crowded with wooden houses huddled together like a patchwork quilt. The forests had been cut back to make room for farms, though vast stretches of wild land remained, pressing against the edges of human effort. Yet, for the ordinary man, woman, and child, existence remained a circle. Sunrise to sunset, toil, rest, and then another day much the same. A typical morning began with the sound of a rooster, or perhaps the thud of an axe against a block of wood. Fires had to be rekindled from glowing embers, and food had to be prepared long before the first light filtered through small, glassless windows. In wealthier households, small panes of imported glass had been fitted, but most still relied on oiled paper or shutters. The winters had not grown easier, nor had the summers lost their relentless bite of insects, heat, and humidity. People were used to discomfort, and it had become almost invisible to them, part of the background noise of life. Children grew into their roles early. Boys followed their fathers into the fields or into the forests to fell trees, while girls learned to spin, weave, cook, and tend to younger siblings. Schooling existed in some towns, but often education was basic, learning letters, reading from the Bible, and practicing arithmetic to manage farm accounts or trade. Anything beyond that was rare and often reserved for the children of ministers, merchants, or the wealthiest landowners. Even so, stories and songs carried knowledge from one generation to the next, and there was wisdom in the rhythms of work, in the memory of how to survive a harsh season or repair what had broken. Religious life still formed the backbone of the community. The church bell was not merely a summons to prayer, but also a marker of time, a rallying cry in moments of danger, and sometimes even the only source of news. Services were long, often stretching for hours, with stern sermons delivered in cold meeting houses where families huddled together under blankets to endure both the chill and the weight of moral instruction. Ministers spoke of sin, salvation, and the need for obedience, not only to God, but to the structures of authority that shaped village life. Yet beneath the surface, doubts and disagreements simmered. Not everyone accepted the rigid control of religious leaders, and some whispered of more personal, private paths to faith. Daily sustenance was still a matter of labor and luck. Bread was baked from cornmeal or coarse wheat flour, and stews bubbled slowly over hearth fires, their flavors plain but nourishing. Preservation remained essential. Barrels of salted fish, dried apples, smoked meat, and hard cheeses sustained families through the long stretches when fresh food was scarce. Hunger had not vanished, though it was not always spoken of openly. Pride kept many from admitting how thin their cupboards grew toward the end of winter. Social life, though sparse, had its rituals. Quilting bees, barn raisings, and harvest festivals gave moments of respite from routine. Neighbors gathered, exchanged stories, and sometimes danced when the work was done, though such pleasures were always framed within the boundaries of propriety. Gossip traveled quickly across small towns. Who had fallen ill? Who had married? Who had failed to bring in a proper harvest? All of these became the threads that stitched together the social fabric. The colonies were small enough that everyone knew everyone else's story, whether or not it was welcome knowledge. The presence of distant rulers, kings, governors, and councils, remained abstract for most. People felt their power through taxes, through the enforcement of laws, or through the arrival of soldiers sent to guard against threats. But for the average farmer or craftsman, London was as distant as the moon. What mattered was whether the cow calved safely, whether the harvest would last until spring, whether the family stayed alive through sickness and storm. Political debates belonged to others. Survival belonged to them. Yet even survival had begun to change in subtle ways. Trade routes had expanded, and with them came goods from across the ocean. Cloth, tools, books, and luxuries that only a generation before had been unimaginable in these small settlements. A teacup made in China might rest on the shelf of a modest home, a token of connection to a world vast and mysterious. But these luxuries were fragile things. They broke, they wore out, and they were reminders of how dependent the colonies remained on ships that crossed dangerous seas. Illness continued to shape life in ways both visible and unseen. Smallpox swept through towns with terrifying speed, leaving scars on survivors and taking children before they had lived long enough to speak more than a few words. Other sicknesses came quietly. Fevers that never broke, coughs that deepened into silence, or infections from a simple cut. Doctors existed, but their remedies were often as dangerous as the diseases themselves. Bloodletting, strange tonics, and desperate prayers marked the limits of human knowledge. Families bore loss with the stoic endurance that had become second nature, but grief lingered, woven into the air of every community. For many, the landscape itself remained a constant reminder of fragility. The forests, though cut back, were still immense and filled with both danger and possibility. Wolves and bears roamed the edges of settlements, and stories of encounters became part of fireside lore. The rivers, while essential for trade and sustenance, claimed lives in floods or accidents. The land promised opportunity, yet it demanded an endless price in sweat, blood, and time. Despite the monotony, there were undercurrents of change in thought. Books and pamphlets trickled in, carrying new ideas about science, reason, and freedom of conscience. Not everyone could read them, but whispers spread of thinkers in Europe who spoke of rights, of knowledge beyond the church's teachings, of a wider world where authority could be questioned. These whispers did not yet disturb the cycle of daily life, but they planted seeds that, in time, would grow. Nighttime in the colonies carried its own weight of stillness. After candles were snuffed and hearths glowed faintly, the darkness outside pressed close against the thin walls of homes. Families lay in narrow beds, often sharing them for warmth, listening to the sounds of wind, animals, or distant footsteps. It was a silence filled not with peace, but with the awareness of vulnerability. Every creak of wood, every howl of wind, reminded them of their place at the edge of a vast and untamed world. Generations were born into this life and knew little else. A grandfather who had crossed the sea spoke of hardships that seemed half legendary to his grandchildren, yet the struggles of the present were enough to keep them grounded. Time passed slowly, marked not by great events, but by small victories. The birth of a child who survived the first fragile years, the harvest that did not fail, the winter that passed without famine. In this way, the colonies moved forward, not through dramatic upheaval or sweeping progress, but through the steady, grinding persistence of ordinary lives. People endured because they had no other choice. They laughed, they grieved, they worked, and they prayed. And in their endurance, they laid the groundwork for something they could not yet see. It was history in its quietest form, long stretches of uneventful days, stitched together into years, into decades. The kind of history that seldom fills books, yet without which no grand story could ever be written. The colonies drifted into the middle of the 18th century with a peculiar tension between sameness and change. For most ordinary families, life remained a cycle of toil and survival. Yet, beneath the surface, invisible currents were gathering. To live in these years was to dwell in a paradox. The monotony of endless chores, seasons repeating like clockwork, and yet a quiet sense that something in the world around them was beginning to shift. Everyday life still began with the first light and ended with the last flicker of flame. A farmer rose before dawn, his hands already calloused from years of work. He tended to his animals, walked the fields to judge the soil, and planned out the endless tasks of mending fences, sharpening tools, or carting goods to town. His wife, meanwhile, oversaw the rhythm of the household, bread rising by the hearth, children scrambling for chores, cloth being spun, and the steady work of cleaning, preserving, and repairing. Their children's lives mirrored their own, set on tracks that seemed immovable. A boy knew he would inherit his father's work, a girl her mother's skills. The wheel turned, as it always had. Yet there were cracks in this pattern, faint lines that few could articulate, but many could feel. Trade had widened. Ships came and went with greater frequency, bringing not only cloth and tools, but also books, pamphlets, and ideas. A craftsman might overhear discussions about philosophy in the tavern. A literate farmer might borrow a pamphlet from a neighbor who had purchased it from a traveling bookseller. The language of rights, liberty, and conscience was quietly filtering into communities that had once been insulated by forests and fields. At the same time, the presence of distant authority became harder to ignore. Taxes, tariffs, and regulations crept into conversation. Some barely understood them, but they felt the weight in their pockets when coin grew scarce. Others resented the presence of governors and officials who spoke with the authority of a crown thousands of miles away. And though these grievances had not yet reached a fever pitch, they were seeds, and seeds have a way of taking root. Daily monotony still dominated. Winters froze the land into silence, where survival meant rationing the last stores of grain or salted fish, hoping that spring would come before hunger did. Summers were humid, relentless, filled with mosquitoes that spread fevers. Work was inescapable. Fields needed plowing, livestock needed care, and houses needed constant maintenance. Most days passed without event, yet life was punctuated by small dramas. A child falling ill, a neighbor injured, a sudden storm flattening a field of crops. These were not the kinds of events that reached the pages of history, yet they were the fabric of existence for millions. Communities still relied on each other. Barn raisings were as much about survival as social gatherings, with men lifting beams while women prepared food, children running at the edges of the work. Quilting circles, communal harvests, and the sharing of tools reminded everyone that no family survived in isolation. Yet gossip and disputes also thrived in these close quarters. Arguments over land boundaries, religious differences, or debts simmered. Sometimes they erupted into court cases or feuds that lasted for years, further weaving human drama into the tapestry of dull endurance. Religion remained central. The meeting house dominated the town square, both physically and spiritually. Sundays were still the longest day of the week, with sermons that pressed heavily on minds and hearts. But new voices were rising. Traveling preachers stirred emotions with fiery speeches, calling for personal awakening and spiritual rebirth. Some embraced these revivals, others dismissed them as unsettling disruptions to the order of things. Families argued quietly at their hearths, torn between tradition and change. The seeds of religious freedom were being sown here too, though few realized it at the time. Illness remained the great equalizer. No matter how wealthy or poor, sickness could sweep through a household and leave devastation in its wake. Smallpox, measles, and influenza did not respect boundaries. Whole families could vanish from records in a matter of weeks. Doctors and midwives did what they could, but remedies were uncertain, often harmful. Prayers filled the silence when medicine failed, and graves filled the ground behind churches and in small family plots. For children, life was both limited and expansive. They saw only their immediate surroundings, their homes, fields, and neighbors. But within that small world, they bore enormous responsibilities. A boy as young as 8 might drive oxen in the fields, while a girl of 10 might manage younger siblings or spin wool for hours each day. Play existed, of course. Games with sticks and stones, chasing one another through fields. But it was fleeting, squeezed between duties. Childhood, as it would later be imagined, was a luxury these children did not know. Despite hardships, there were small pleasures that gave rhythm to life. A song sung during evening chores, a gathering at harvest, with fiddles and dancing, the telling of stories by firelight, tales that blended truth and imagination. These moments did not erase the drudgery, but they softened it. They gave people a sense of belonging and continuity, a reminder that they were part of something larger than themselves. In towns, taverns had become hubs of conversation. Farmers, craftsmen, and sailors gathered to drink ale, exchange news, and debate matters far beyond their daily work. Newspapers circulated, carrying stories of conflicts overseas, of kings and parliaments, of wars and treaties. Much of it seemed distant, but in those tavern conversations, ordinary men found themselves speaking of politics, of rights, of belonging. Such talk did not yet feel revolutionary, but it was new. It was a kind of awakening, slow and uneven, but real. At night, when work was done, when candles flickered low, families sat together in silence or in small talk. The world outside remained vast, dark, and mysterious. The crack of a branch, the call of an owl, or the distant howl of a wolf could unsettle even the most tired worker. The colonies were still on the edge of wilderness, and that wilderness never let people forget how fragile their presence was. And so life continued, day after day, year after year. It was a life that would seem unbearably dull to those who came later, who read of revolutions and wars. But it was this life, the grinding, repetitive, resilient endurance, that made everything else possible. A world built plank by plank, furrow by furrow, sermon by sermon. A world where change was coming, though the people living through it rarely saw it clearly. They carried on. They always carried on, and in that carrying on, the colonies moved closer to the threshold of something vast, though none could yet name it. The middle of the 18th century brought with it an unsettling quiet, a quiet that was not the peaceful hum of routine life, but the sort of silence that comes before a storm. For the common families of the colonies, life still circled around the same small things: the weather, the harvest, the health of their children, the turning of the seasons. Yet, increasingly, whispers of trouble, of burdens imposed from faraway rulers, crept into even the smallest and most isolated villages. What had once seemed distant, the decisions of kings, parliaments, and merchants across the sea, was beginning to press against the lives of ordinary men and women in ways that could not be ignored. The taxes were the first sign. To a farmer who barely scraped together enough to see his family through a long winter, the addition of even a few coins demanded by officials seemed almost cruel. Tariffs made imported goods, cloth, tools, sugar, tea, more expensive, and while luxuries were optional, certain items had grown into necessities. Salt to preserve food, nails to build and repair homes, paper, scarce but needed for contracts and letters. When the price of these goods rose, it was not simply an inconvenience. It was another burden pressing on backs already stooped with labor. Still, daily life continued. The mornings began with the same frost on the windows, the same aching joints as men trudged to the fields or workshops, the same quiet determination of women at the hearth. The monotony had not vanished, yet alongside it came new layers of frustration. A tavern conversation might begin with weather but end with complaints about unfair laws. A neighbor might stop at the edge of a field, leaning on his hoe, and grumble about merchants growing wealthy while farmers remained poor. These were not fiery speeches or organized protests, at least not yet. They were small sparks, scattered in ordinary talk, that hinted at the gathering fire. Religious life, too, reflected this tension. Ministers still preached obedience, humility, and patience, but increasingly they found their congregations distracted. Some listened with furrowed brows, thinking more about the tax collector's last visit than about the minister's stern warnings of sin. Traveling preachers spoke not just of spiritual renewal, but also of the individual's direct relationship with God, a message that subtly undermined the old structures of authority. If a man could question the dictates of his minister, could he not also question the dictates of a governor? If salvation came through personal conviction, Could liberty not also be claimed through personal right? The seeds of doubt planted by religion were blossoming into seeds of resistance. The taverns had grown louder. Where once they had been places of rest from endless work, they now buzzed with debates. News traveled faster than ever, carried on ships and spread by newspapers that circulated through towns. Stories of wars in Europe, of parliaments' decisions, of other colonies resisting royal edicts, all found their way into mugs of ale and into the ears of tired farmers and artisans. What once had seemed far away now felt immediate, as if the very walls of the taverns echoed with the sound of distant powers reaching across the ocean to meddle in daily lives. But rebellion, if it could be called that, was not yet a fire. It was still a murmur. Families still rose before dawn, still worked until their bodies ached, still struggled through illness and loss. A man who cursed the taxes at night still rose to plow his field at first light. A woman who grumbled over the price of cloth still spun wool in the quiet of her home. The rhythm of survival kept them bound, and yet, beneath that rhythm, discontent was sharpening its edge. Even the children began to sense the change, though they could not understand it. They heard their fathers argue with neighbors, their mothers whisper late at night. They saw the scowls at the mention of officials, the way voices grew tight when letters arrived bearing seals of authority. To children, life was still chores and play, but they absorbed the tension like dry wood waiting for a spark. The landscape itself remained as relentless as ever. The forests pressed in, the winters froze, the summers burned. Illness struck without warning. Wolves still prowled. Floods still swept away the fruits of labor. Nature demanded endurance, and people endured as they always had. Yet now, layered on top of these struggles, was the weight of human authority, of rules imposed not by God or the land, but by other men who claimed power from a throne across the sea. For many, that was a burden harder to bear than hunger or cold. One might sit at a hearth, staring into the flames after a long day's work, and feel the strange duality of existence, the sameness of daily life, and the growing sense that something was about to break. The crack of firewood splitting, the howl of wind against the shutters, the murmur of neighbors arguing across the lane. These ordinary sounds carried with them an edge of unease. Change was coming, slowly, quietly, but surely. It was still boring history in many ways. The lives of most colonists were not marked by battles or grand speeches. They were marked by endless chores, small joys, private griefs. But through these small lives, through their complaints and quiet resistance, a new path was being carved. The world was shifting, even if most of its inhabitants only felt it as a vague unease. And so the colonies carried on, working, enduring, complaining, surviving. But beneath the monotony, the murmurs of dissatisfaction were growing louder. The taverns were noisier, the sermons more contested, the taxes more resented. The sense of distance between ruler and ruled was widening, and though few yet spoke of revolution, the thought was creeping closer with every passing season. It was the kind of change that history books rarely capture in detail. The slow build of frustration, the small moments of discontent that accumulate like snow on a roof until the weight is too heavy to bear. The people did not know it, but they were living on the edge of a story that would soon cease to be boring at all. The mid-18th century was not remembered by those who lived it as a time of glory or grand speeches. For the ordinary families of the colonies, it was another series of years filled with labor, hardship, and monotony. The sun rose, the cows needed milking, fields demanded plowing, and winters still froze marrow in the bone. Children grew into their chores before they grew into their height. Women bore the weight of households as steadily as men bore the weight of soil and wood. And yet, within this sameness, new pressures were creeping in, subtle but heavy. Pressures that came not from the land or the sky, but from men across the sea who claimed authority over lives they never saw. Taxes had always been part of existence, though most families thought little of them. A few coins here, a fee there. But when new laws began to arrive from London, laws written by strangers who had never walked a muddy colonial road, people noticed. The Stamp Act, though it seemed minor to some, touched nearly every family. Paper was not plentiful in the colonies, but it was essential for wills, for contracts, for deeds, for news. To demand a stamp on every document, every piece of printed material, was to reach into the pockets of farmers, merchants, and even tavern keepers who needed receipts for trade. In many homes, fathers grumbled over the added cost, while mothers calculated how to stretch meager supplies. A man who had never before spoken of politics might slam his hand on a rough-hewn table and curse the price of stamped paper. A tavern owner might pour ale into a mug and mutter that he could barely afford to keep his business open. It was not the act itself, nor even the coins demanded, but the principle. Why should they, who had carved their homes from forests and buried their kin in cold ground, bow to a parliament 3,000 miles away? Still, life was not consumed by protest. Work remained. A child still needed new shoes for winter, whether the leather was taxed or not. A roof still leaked, whether or not paper bore a royal stamp. The rhythm of survival dulled the edges of anger. Most men still woke before dawn, bent their backs to earth or wood, and returned home too weary to think of politics. But in the small spaces between, dissatisfaction found its voice. Taverns grew noisier. What had once been simple gossip, who had harvested early, who had fallen ill, now included talk of boycotts, petitions, and resistance. Not everyone understood these words. Many nodded silently, not wanting to appear ignorant, but felt in their bones that change was brewing. When newspapers carried articles against the Stamp Act, read aloud by those who could decipher them, listeners crowded close, mugs of ale forgotten in their hands. In the flicker of candlelight, with the smell of wood smoke and spilled drink heavy in the air, ordinary men and women heard phrases about liberty, representation, and tyranny. They did not always grasp the full meaning, but they felt the fire beneath the words. At home, these conversations carried on in whispers. A woman kneading dough might ask her husband if he had heard what the preacher said about unfair rulers. A child, listening at the hearth, might repeat words half understood. Liberty, freedom, rights, without knowing what they meant. Families, long used to silence and endurance, found themselves speaking more boldly, if only within their own four walls. Religious leaders could not avoid the subject. Some clung to obedience, preaching that authority was God's will and must be honored. Others, stirred by new currents of thought, spoke of freedom as a divine gift. Congregations were divided, some nodding in agreement with fiery words, others frowning in disapproval. The meeting house, once the unquestioned center of order, had become another place of quiet dispute. Meanwhile, the Townshend Acts added fuel to the smoldering fire. Duties on glass, lead, paints, and tea reached into every household. A mother, scrubbing her floor, might pause to complain that the paint to brighten her walls now cost too much. A craftsman, hammering nails into a frame, cursed that glass for his windows was priced beyond his reach. Tea, once a comfort in cold evenings, became a bitter reminder of faraway rulers. Even those who drank it quietly, unwilling to join boycotts, felt the sting of resentment each time they lifted a cup. Children, who had no stake in politics, absorbed the atmosphere nonetheless. They noticed the silence when officials passed through town. They heard their fathers' tones harden when speaking of merchants loyal to the crown. They saw their mothers stretch meals thinner, grumble over empty cupboards, or scold them for wasting scraps. Politics was not an abstract thing to them. It was the hunger in their bellies, the thinness of their blankets, the arguments whispered late at night. Protests did not always look like grand uprisings. Sometimes they were small acts. A man refusing to buy imported cloth, a woman spinning homespun wool in protest, a tavern refusing to sell tea. These acts were quiet, even boring to the eyes of history, but they were powerful in their accumulation. They showed that ordinary people, farmers, weavers, shopkeepers, were willing to endure inconvenience to resist. The British soldiers who began appearing in towns only deepened the unease. Red-coated men marching in disciplined lines seemed out of place against muddy streets and wooden houses. To some, they were a reassurance of order. To others, they were a threat, a reminder that obedience was not voluntary, but demanded under the shadow of muskets. Children gawked at them with wide eyes. Farmers spat in the dirt as they passed. Women pulled their shawls tighter, muttering that soldiers had no business in their streets. And yet, amid all of this, life carried on with its dull persistence. Fields were plowed, harvests stored, babies born, the sick buried. Families still huddled around hearths in the long nights, listening to the crackle of firewood and the howl of winter winds. The monotony had not disappeared, nor had the hardships of survival lessened. But now, layered over this familiar struggle, was a growing sense that the lives of ordinary people were no longer fully their own. The boredom of history, the endless days of toil, had become the soil in which discontent rooted itself. Each tax, each regulation, each soldier marching on colonial roads was another drop of water feeding that root. To those living through it, nothing seemed sudden. The change came slowly, like the shift of seasons, but it came nonetheless. And so the colonies moved closer to a moment they could not yet name. The taverns still buzzed, the churches still argued, the homes still whispered. Work continued, but alongside it came anger, confusion, and hope. The ordinary people, those whose names would never fill history books, were unknowingly becoming the foundation of something extraordinary. The storm had not yet broken, but in the quiet monotony of their days, the people of the colonies were preparing for it, whether they knew it or not. Life in the colonies in the years leading up to the mid-1770s was, on the surface, still dominated by repetition and routine. Children awoke to the crow of roosters, and adults rose with aching backs to tend fields, livestock, or workshops. Women began their chores before dawn, grinding corn, baking bread, spinning wool, and ensuring that their families had the basic necessities to endure long days. Despite the growing tension in politics and commerce, the daily grind of survival persisted. Fields still demanded planting and harvesting, barns needed repairing, and the forests remained both a resource and a threat, with wolves prowling the edges and hidden dangers lurking in uncharted land. Yet, beneath the surface of this apparent monotony, ordinary people were beginning to notice the accumulating weight of distant authority pressing on their lives. The Townshend Acts, which taxed everyday necessities such as glass, paint, lead, paper, and tea, had begun to gnaw at households' already stretched resources. Families grumbled quietly at the hearth about the rising cost of tea or the price of paper for letters and receipts. In taverns, conversations that once focused solely on local events now increasingly carried complaints about the Crown's distant power. Farmers, artisans, and tradesmen debated the fairness of laws imposed by men who had never set foot on colonial soil. The murmurs of frustration and injustice began to circulate, slowly knitting together a collective consciousness that something needed to change. Children, though largely oblivious to the specifics of taxation or parliamentary decrees, absorbed the tension as naturally as they absorbed the rhythm of daily work. They witnessed whispered arguments at night, the nervous pacing of fathers in candlelit rooms, and mothers' subdued complaints over rising prices. The sense of unease became woven into the fabric of their childhood, a backdrop to the chores, games, and fleeting joys of youth. Social gatherings, which had long offered a brief respite from the tedium of work, began to carry undertones of political awareness. Barn raisings, quilting bees, and harvest festivals now provided space for hushed discussions about boycotts, protests, and resistance. Taverns buzzed with debates over pamphlets that had traveled from Boston or Philadelphia, read aloud to listeners eager to catch every word. Ordinary colonists discussed ideas that would have seemed radical only a few years prior: representation, liberty, and the right to resist unjust authority. While these discussions were still tentative and fragmented, they marked a subtle yet profound shift in public consciousness. In Boston, tension reached a point where frustration could no longer be contained in whispers. Soldiers stationed in the city to enforce laws became symbols of oppression. Ordinary citizens, who had once passed the red-coated troops with indifferent curiosity, now glared at them with suspicion and anger. The presence of British soldiers in streets and marketplaces transformed mundane daily interactions into moments heavy with anxiety. Farmers transporting goods, shopkeepers tending their stores, and children running errands all experienced the subtle but persistent pressure of living under a watchful eye. In March of 1770, these tensions erupted in a tragedy that would be remembered for generations: the Boston Massacre. While the event itself was swift, 5 men killed, several wounded, the impact rippled far beyond the immediate incident. For ordinary people living miles away, the news arrived through word of mouth, letters, and newspapers, sometimes days or weeks after the fact. Communities discussed it at length in homes, taverns, and meeting houses. Families debated what it meant, whether justice could or would be served, and whether life would ever return to a semblance of normalcy. The massacre was shocking, but it was also illustrative of a growing reality. The distant authority of Britain could reach into the lives of ordinary colonists with deadly force. Even as public outrage simmered, daily life continued. A farmer could not abandon his plow because soldiers had fired upon townsmen. A weaver could not cease spinning because of political outrage. Life's necessities, the chores, the meals, the care of children and animals, remained unchanged. Yet, intertwined with the routine, there existed a pervasive awareness that life was no longer wholly predictable, that survival alone was insufficient. The ordinary had become extraordinary, not through spectacle but through the quiet, cumulative pressures pressing on every household. Women's roles in resistance also grew more pronounced during these years. They continued to manage households under economic strain, but now their daily work often carried subtle political weight. Spinning homespun cloth became both necessity and defiance, while choosing not to purchase taxed goods became a quiet, deliberate act of protest. Tea, once a comforting ritual, now held symbolic significance. Brewing local herbs instead of imported leaves was an ordinary act that nevertheless carried the weight of collective resistance. Through these small, largely invisible acts, women shaped the culture of dissent as much as men did through tavern debates and militia drills. Children, too, were being drawn into the currents of unrest. Though in ways often unnoticed, games and mimicry became politically infused. Boys might pretend to be soldiers marching against imagined redcoats, while girls might organize their own small, spinning bees as part of their play. These exercises of imagination reflected the growing awareness that the world around them was not static, that the actions of adults had consequences, and that the ordinary rhythms of life were being punctuated by extraordinary events. Militia training began to increase quietly in villages far from Boston. Men who had previously only handled tools and plows now drilled with muskets in fields after their work was done. At first, these practices were tentative and half-hearted, often laughable to outsiders. But repetition bred skill, and over time, drills became more disciplined and serious. Ordinary farmers, blacksmiths, carpenters, and laborers were slowly transforming into men capable of coordinated action, all while maintaining the appearance of routine life. The monotony of existence masked the subtle preparation for conflict, a duality that history would later remember as the foundation of a revolution. News of organized boycotts, of protests against taxed goods, and of pamphlets calling for collective action spread through postal networks and gossip alike. The message was simple, yet profound. Ordinary people had power when united. But unity was difficult to achieve in scattered settlements, where daily survival often outweighed political ideals. Letters and newspapers carried arguments and instructions. Yet implementation depended on ordinary people making conscious choices, choosing which goods to buy, which merchants to support, which rituals to abandon. Resistance was built from countless small, ordinary decisions, each one seemingly insignificant on its own, yet cumulatively forming a pattern of defiance. As the colonies edged closer to 1773, the Tea Act presented another point of contention. Tea, a luxury and a comfort, now became a symbol of oppression. Ordinary families debated in homes whether to consume the taxed product or find alternatives. Tavern owners faced the dilemma of serving patrons while adhering to boycotts. Merchants calculated profit and risk. Every cup consumed, avoided, or replaced carried subtle political weight. The Boston Tea Party of December 1773, in which chests of tea were dumped into the harbor, may have seemed distant to those living inland, yet its effects were felt everywhere. The symbolic act confirmed that resistance was not merely talk, but could translate into action, however dramatic or destructive. Even as political unrest intensified, the underlying monotony of life persisted. Fields needed plowing, roofs needed repair, children needed feeding and clothing. Ordinary households juggled survival with conscience, maintaining their routines while navigating a new reality in which distant authority had become an intrusive, often threatening presence. Illness, death, and seasonal hardships did not pause for political debate. Families endured, adapted, and persisted, their ordinary lives imbued with a subtle yet profound sense of historical significance. In small towns and rural homesteads, the ordinary became extraordinary. Work, ritual, and survival intertwined with resistance, shaping a new social consciousness. Ordinary people who had spent generations living in repetitive cycles of labor and quiet endurance were now actors in events that would change their world irrevocably. The boring life of daily chores, spinning wool, milking cows, and plowing fields had been transformed. Beneath the surface of monotony, ordinary people had begun to carry the weight of revolution. Though they did not yet realize it, the groundwork for larger confrontation was being laid in every tavern, in every home, in every village and town. Small acts of defiance, subtle conversations, and silent refusals combined into a collective force, unseen but growing. The colonists were awakening to the idea that their voices, their choices, and their daily actions mattered in ways they had never mattered before. The storm was approaching, inexorable and unstoppable. And yet, for the ordinary people who would live through it, the days still began with roosters and ended by firelight, the chores unchanged, the rhythm familiar. History, as it often does, had been slow to reveal itself, hiding behind the mundane and the monotonous. But beneath that ordinary exterior, extraordinary change was stirring, preparing to sweep through lives that had known little but work, hardship, and endurance. The dawn of the 1770s in the American colonies was a period of extraordinary tension hidden beneath the surface of ordinary life. To an outsider, or even to many of the colonists themselves, days passed with the same relentless rhythm. Sunrise brought labor, chores, and care for family. Evenings ended with exhausted bodies huddled near fires, listening to the crackle of wood and the occasional howl of wolves in the distance. Fields still demanded plowing, cows still needed milking, bread still needed baking, and children were expected to rise early to tend chores or assist in the labor of survival. Life seemed, on the surface, unchanged. It was, in fact, precisely this ordinariness that made the undercurrents of resistance so effective. Taxes and laws imposed by a distant parliament had begun to embed themselves deeply into daily routines. The Tea Act, designed to bail out the struggling East India Company, had touched every household in a way no one could ignore. Tea, once a symbol of comfort and domestic leisure, became a measure of oppression. Mothers, who had measured the ritual cup in the early mornings, while children clutched bowls of oatmeal or cornmeal mush, now calculated the cost of imported leaves against already stretched household budgets. Fathers, previously silent on matters of law or politics, grumbled in taverns, on the street, or quietly in homes about the unfairness of paying taxes for goods they could not control. Each household, each individual, had begun to act as its own site of subtle protest, from spinning homespun cloth to choosing local herbs over imported tea. Despite these pressures, life demanded attention. Fields could not wait for a political debate. The soil remained unyielding, the weather indifferent. Cows, chickens, and pigs demanded care, and barns rotted if left unattended. The rhythm of labor was constant, and the endurance of ordinary people was relentless. Yet, layered atop this daily monotony, a quiet awareness was spreading. Conversations that once revolved around the weather or local gossip now included words like liberty, taxation, and representation. Families whispered about the events in Boston, about chests of tea thrown into the harbor, about soldiers firing into crowds, and the injustices of distant governance. Even children, absorbing these discussions, carried them into games and play, mimicking soldiers and town meetings in backyards and empty fields. Militia activity increased in towns large and small. Men who had spent years working the land or the forge now took to drills after their daily labor, training with muskets and practicing formations. These exercises, at first awkward and occasionally laughable, became more disciplined as word spread of the growing unrest. Ordinary farmers, blacksmiths, and tradesmen, once only accustomed to tools of labor, were learning to wield tools of potential resistance. They carried on their routines. Yet, underneath the rhythm of work, they were preparing for confrontation they did not fully anticipate but instinctively understood as necessary. Taverns and meeting houses had become arenas for information and debate. Patrons and parishioners exchanged letters, read aloud pamphlets, and discussed the unfolding political drama. The arguments were often confusing, filled with references to acts of parliament, distant courts, and abstract ideas of natural rights, but their essence was unmistakable. The people were beginning to recognize their collective power. Everyday decisions, whether to buy imported goods, which merchants to patronize, which laws to quietly resist, had begun to shape the contours of resistance. Ordinary life, banal as it appeared, had become political. At home, women continued their dual roles of caretakers and subtle activists. Spinning, baking, and sewing became acts imbued with meaning. Every spool of homespun wool, every loaf baked without taxed ingredients, became a quiet but deliberate contribution to the collective effort. Mothers taught children these practices not merely as household management, but as a lesson in agency, demonstrating that even ordinary actions could resist distant authority. They managed to maintain their household duties while simultaneously nurturing a growing consciousness of civic responsibility and moral choice. Children, often overlooked in accounts of these years, were quietly learning their place in a world poised for upheaval. Boys mimicked soldiers, forming lines in fields and marching with sticks, while girls organized pretend spinning circles, absorbing lessons of domestic economy intertwined with politics. Play became a rehearsal, unconscious yet meaningful, for roles they would occupy as sons and daughters, neighbors, and participants in a society under pressure. Their education, both formal and informal, was suffused with the rhythms of work, and the subtle codes of resistance learned from elders. News from Boston, New York, and Philadelphia traveled slowly but carried immense weight. Ordinary citizens listened intently, parsing truth from rumor, piecing together a broader picture from fragmentary letters and newspaper accounts. Stories of boycotts, public protests, and legal challenges revealed that the colonies were not isolated, but part of a growing network of concern and action. Individual homes and small towns became nodes in this network, linked by shared grievances and emerging strategies of resistance. Economic life, already precarious, now required careful navigation. Merchants faced moral and financial choices: to honor boycotts, risking profit, or comply with imported goods, risking communal disapproval. Farmers negotiated whether to sell to compliant buyers or risk the wrath of neighbors. Every transaction, no matter how mundane, carried political significance. Ordinary choices were transforming into collective action, even if the participants considered them simply as practical decisions for survival and reputation. Even in the rhythm of hardship, long hours, illness, and scarcity, people began to sense a new order forming, one in which their voices, their labor, and their choices had weight beyond the immediate household. The ordinary acts of daily life, feeding children, mending fences, preparing food, maintaining homes, had become intertwined with political consciousness, creating a slow, pervasive shift in the social fabric. Survival alone was no longer sufficient. Moral and civic awareness had become a necessity. As the colonies edged toward 1774, the accumulation of ordinary resistance, subtle preparation, and quiet debate made the impossible conceivable. Town meetings, petitions, and committees of correspondence began to coordinate action across settlements. The ordinary, once synonymous with routine, had become the backbone of extraordinary change. Individuals who had known only the repetition of work, toil, and survival now discovered agency in small but consequential acts. Ordinary lives, maintained amid hardship and monotony, were laying the groundwork for open confrontation. And yet, despite these shifts, the rhythm of life persisted. Children still ran errands, tended animals, and assisted in household chores. Fields were still plowed, barns repaired, and bread baked. Fires still crackled in the hearths at night, while ordinary families listened to the wind outside and whispered of news they barely fully understood. The extraordinary, it seemed, was being constructed within the ordinary, like a hidden scaffolding beneath the familiar walls of daily life. By the close of the decade, the colonies stood on the precipice of open rebellion, though many of the people living through it did not recognize the moment for what it was. Their days were filled with the same labor, the same chores, the same quiet endurance that had defined life for generations. But beneath the surface, resistance, preparation, and a shared sense of injustice had coalesced into a force that would soon reshape their world entirely. The seemingly boring, repetitive existence of ordinary people had become the foundation for a revolution that history would later call remarkable, though for those living it, it was merely the continuation of life under pressure, marked by the faint, persistent hum of discontent. The years following the Boston Tea Party were remarkable, not because of the dramatic, immediate upheavals that one might imagine, but because of how ordinary life persisted amid mounting tension. To the families of the colonies, days remained filled with the same relentless cycles of labor and survival. The rooster's crow still marked the beginning of the day. Children scrambled out of beds to help with chores or to run errands for neighbors. Women tended hearth and home, kneading dough, spinning wool, preserving fruits and vegetables, patching worn clothes, and nursing the sick. Men worked the fields, repaired fences, and tended livestock. And yet, intertwined with these familiar rhythms, life had taken on a new, heavy significance: the ever-present shadow of political unrest. Ordinary citizens could not escape the impact of Britain's response to the Tea Party. The coercive acts, which the British called the Intolerable Acts, aimed to tighten control over Massachusetts and, by extension, the colonies. The closure of Boston Harbor, the dissolution of local assemblies, and the enforcement of martial law seemed distant to those in rural villages. Yet news traveled quickly through letters, newspapers, and travelers. Families across New England and beyond whispered anxiously around hearths, speculating about what it meant for their livelihoods, their neighbors, and their children. The measures sparked confusion, fear, and resentment. A farmer might stand in his field, hoe in hand, and shake his head at the news of ships barred from entering Boston Harbor. He did not own ships, nor trade directly in imported tea, but he understood the symbolic weight. Distant authorities could, at will, disrupt the normal patterns of life he depended upon. A carpenter repairing his roof muttered to himself about laws that seemed designed to strip ordinary people of any autonomy. A mother, scouring the cupboard for provisions, cursed the taxes and restrictions that had turned familiar goods into luxuries she could barely afford. Yet, despite the growing frustration, the daily routines persisted. The fields needed tending, livestock required feeding, bread had to be baked. The physical and temporal demands of survival allowed no pause for despair. And so, even as resentment simmered, ordinary life continued, an intricate dance of adaptation to both hardship and political pressure. The mundane became the canvas on which resistance slowly painted itself. In towns and villages, ordinary people began to take action in subtle but persistent ways. Committees of correspondence, formed to maintain communication between settlements, allowed news of British oppression and colonial response to travel quickly. Farmers, artisans, and tradesmen began attending town meetings in greater numbers, learning the language of civic duty and collective action. They debated petitions and letters to the Crown, often at night after long days of labor, illuminated only by the flickering light of oil lamps or candles. The meetings themselves were unremarkable in appearance, men sitting on rough benches, women whispering nearby, but the ideas exchanged were revolutionary in their implications. The boycotts that had begun with tea extended to other goods, and ordinary families adapted with remarkable ingenuity. Women substituted local herbs for imported teas, spun homespun cloth in place of taxed textiles, and found new ways to manage households under financial constraints. Children assisted in these acts, learning through daily chores that resistance was not always loud or dramatic. It could be practical, quiet, and persistent. Even the smallest decisions carried weight. Choosing not to buy imported sugar, refusing to drink taxed coffee, or offering neighbors alternative goods in place of imports were all acts of collective defiance. In the larger towns, taverns became hubs of organized discussion. Men who had spent decades attending only to local matters now debated political philosophy, taxation, and the principles of representation. They shared letters, news clippings, and first-hand accounts of British soldiers patrolling streets or breaking up assemblies. Even tradesmen who had previously shunned political discussion began to recognize the significance of coordinated action. Their daily routines, crafting, trading, repairing, continued, but they now included careful attention to how their labor intersected with the broader political climate. A blacksmith's tools might also serve to repair weapons for militia drills. A farmer's cart might carry provisions to a committee meeting as easily as it carried produce to market. Religious gatherings, too, reflected the growing awareness of shared grievances. Ministers occasionally incorporated commentary on justice, freedom, and the moral duty to resist oppression. Congregants whispered and nodded, some with agreement, others with unease. The meeting house remained a site of ordinary life, the rhythm of prayer, song, and fellowship, but it also became a subtle conduit for civic awareness. Ordinary routines of worship intertwined with emerging consciousness of collective responsibility. Children, largely ignored in historical narratives, absorbed the tension in the air. They watched their fathers drill with muskets after work. They listened to their mothers explain why homespun cloth was preferable to imported fabric. They observed neighbors refusing taxed goods. They played games that mirrored political conflicts, staging mock trials and simulating street confrontations. Though they could not yet vote, serve on committees, or draft petitions, they were learning the rituals of civic engagement through imitation and observation. Their ordinary childhoods were being transformed, quietly but profoundly, into lessons in participation and moral choice. Even in the midst of increasing organization and awareness, the monotony of survival remained. Illness still struck without warning. Winters were still merciless, and crops still failed. Families struggled against these persistent challenges while simultaneously navigating the pressures of taxation, military presence, and political upheaval. The ordinary, feeding children, mending clothes, preparing meals, tending animals, was inseparable from the extraordinary, the emerging struggle against external authority. Survival itself had become an act of both endurance and subtle resistance. Communication networks among the colonies strengthened. News from Boston, Philadelphia, and New York circulated, allowing distant communities to learn of petitions, boycotts, and assemblies. Ordinary citizens who might never travel more than a few miles from home could now participate in collective action, understanding that their choices mattered not only locally, but regionally. The process was gradual, painstaking, and often frustratingly slow, but it was pervasive, embedding political consciousness into the routine lives of those who would become the foundation of rebellion. By the mid-1770s, ordinary life had become a landscape of quiet vigilance. Every chore, every interaction, every choice carried potential significance. Families continued to rise with the sun and labor until nightfall, yet in those hours, they were also participating in the slow construction of resistance. Ordinary routines, feeding animals, repairing homes, baking bread, were conducted under the shadow of growing tension and political consciousness. And still, amid all this, life maintained its persistent rhythm. Children ran errands, carried messages, and tended chores. Men plowed fields, repaired barns, and drilled with muskets. Women baked, spun, and managed households. Ordinary acts of life and labor had become intertwined with acts of defiance. The ordinary became the foundation for the extraordinary. The seemingly dull routines of daily existence now contained the seed of rebellion, prepared to grow when the moment arrived. The colonies, in their ordinary, repetitive existence, had unknowingly transformed. Through subtle acts of defiance, practical adaptations, and careful observation of events unfolding in distant towns, the people were becoming participants in a revolution. The rhythm of life continued, but the air was charged with anticipation. Every mundane chore, every ordinary conversation, and every quiet act of protest contributed to a larger movement, one that would soon erupt into events that history would remember as monumental. Ordinary life had never been more ordinary, and at the same time, it had never been more pivotal. The early months of 1775 were filled with the kind of slow, persistent tension that made ordinary life feel both familiar and uneasy at the same time. In homes across the colonies, days began with the crow of roosters, as they always had, and ended with tired bodies huddled around hearth fires. Children rose before dawn to assist in chores or gather eggs from the yard, while women busied themselves with grinding corn, baking bread, spinning wool, and preparing meals that would see their families through the day. Men rose to tend fields, repair fences, care for livestock, or work in workshops. Yet, amid these seemingly unremarkable routines, a growing sense of unease had woven itself into daily life. The intolerable acts still cast a long shadow, particularly in Massachusetts. Ordinary citizens in Boston felt the weight of British authority pressing down upon them, But the ripple effects reached far beyond the city. News of closed ports, restricted assemblies, and armed soldiers patrolling streets spread quietly but inexorably into neighboring towns and rural villages. People who had never experienced violence or direct interference now became acutely aware of the reach of distant power. A farmer tending a field in New Hampshire or a carpenter mending a roof in Connecticut might pause mid-task, considering how these far-off measures affected the stability of his livelihood and community. Life went on because it had to. Fields needed planting, animals needed feeding, and homes required maintenance. Illness struck unpredictably, and winters brought freezing temperatures that could ruin a season's efforts. But amid these obligations, people were thinking differently. Conversations in taverns, meeting houses, and kitchens included references to liberty, rights, and collective responsibility. Ordinary people debated petitions, letters to distant governors, and reports of assemblies in Boston or Philadelphia. These discussions, though often incomplete or poorly informed, marked a shift. The private contemplation of injustice was beginning to become public action. In the countryside, militia training had become a regular feature of daily life. Men who had spent decades laboring in fields now lifted muskets after completing their chores, practicing drills and formations with neighbors who were as familiar to them as any workmate. They drilled in silence or with whispered conversation, aware that skill might be needed but uncertain when or how. Children, watching from nearby, absorbed the significance of these routines. Boys mimicked the formations in their play, while girls helped prepare provisions or cared for younger siblings, learning through participation how ordinary acts could support larger efforts. The First Continental Congress had convened in Philadelphia, and news of its decisions traveled slowly but powerfully. Committees of correspondence spread word of agreed boycotts, coordinated letters to the Crown, and calls for restraint that included the preparation for potential conflict. Families discussed these events in hushed tones around their hearths. Parents explained the reasoning behind boycotts, emphasizing that ordinary choices, where to purchase goods, whether to serve taxed tea, or how to manage trade, were small but meaningful contributions to the collective effort. Children observed, listened, and internalized these lessons, unaware that they were participating in the shaping of revolutionary consciousness. Ordinary routines became acts of resistance. Women baked bread with local ingredients, spun wool instead of purchasing imported cloth, and carefully measured provisions to ensure that the household could support collective boycotts. Men conducted trades in a manner consistent with local agreements, refusing to buy from merchants who ignored boycotts or paying extra attention to whom they sold their goods. Even small, mundane interactions, the passing of a note, the sharing of a loaf of bread, the loaning of tools, were infused with political significance. News of troop movements, military preparations, and the presence of British officers in towns added to the subtle pressure of daily life. Farmers and artisans who had previously ignored politics now observed soldiers carefully, noting routines, patterns, and the locations of barracks and patrols. Children witnessed soldiers marching down village roads, red coats glinting in sunlight, drums beating in disciplined rhythm. They whispered to one another, played games that mimicked military formations, and learned by observation how ordinary environments could become sites of strategic awareness. Yet, despite this growing consciousness, the ordinary demands of survival remained unchanged. Fields still required plowing, livestock demanded feeding, and households needed tending. Illness, cold, hunger, and exhaustion did not pause for political deliberation. And so, life became a delicate balance. Ordinary routines were maintained while, at the same time, every act, feeding children, spinning cloth, drilling muskets, became embedded with a quiet, cumulative significance. Resistance was ordinary, and ordinary life had become revolutionary. Letters from Boston, Salem, and Portsmouth arrived in small towns, carrying news of assemblies, petitions, and growing unrest. People read aloud to neighbors, discussed points of contention, and planned boycotts or cooperative responses. Communities that had once been isolated now found themselves linked through shared information and deliberate coordination. Ordinary people, previously defined by repetitive labor and the minutiae of survival, were now participants in a collective process that stretched far beyond their immediate surroundings. As spring approached, the sense of anticipation grew heavier. Town meetings, previously social gatherings or minor civic routines, became places of organized planning. Ordinary men argued over logistics, schedules, and responsibilities. Women supported these efforts indirectly through management of homes and children, providing both material and moral support. Children contributed in ways both visible and subtle, carrying messages, helping with provisions, and observing adult discussions closely enough to absorb lessons of civic engagement and strategy. The monotony of labor, plowing fields, tending gardens, repairing homes, continued. But it was now underscored by vigilance. Every day included small acts of awareness, noting soldier movements, observing loyalist behavior, calculating the timing of shipments or communications. Ordinary life, in all its repetition, had become inseparable from the preparation for confrontation. Simple routines were now layered with political purpose, and survival was intertwined with participation in a collective effort to assert autonomy. By the summer of 1775, ordinary citizens were quietly, yet methodically, readying themselves for the inevitable. Committees coordinated the sharing of information, regulated boycotts, and advised on preparation. Ordinary men drilled with muskets, and women spun and baked with purpose. Children learned through play and observation. The rhythm of daily life continued, but every action carried weight beyond the immediate household. The ordinary had become the foundation for extraordinary change. The first shots at Lexington and Concord, while still months away, were already imminent in the consciousness of ordinary colonists. They could not know the exact day, the precise hour, or the unfolding consequences, but they felt the momentum building. Every chore completed, every conversation held, every loaf baked, and every field plowed contributed to a subtle, invisible readiness. The boring life of labor, family care, and survival had become the lattice on which the coming conflict would unfold. In the quiet of evening, as families gathered by firelight, ordinary life appeared unchanged. Children played, women tended the hearth, and men discussed the day's labor. Yet beneath this apparent normalcy, tension, preparation, and awareness had woven themselves into the very fabric of existence. The colonies were poised on the brink of open rebellion, and ordinary people, maintaining their routines and enduring their hardships, had become the unlikely architects of revolution. The storm was no longer distant. It had crept into kitchens, fields, and workshops, threading its presence into the daily, mundane, and repetitive lives of the colonists. And in these ordinary lives, the extraordinary was quietly being built. The spring of 1725 was a season like any other on the surface. Birds sang in the morning, dew glistened on fields, and the sun rose over towns and villages, casting light on farms, workshops, and quiet streets. Roosters crowed at dawn, children ran barefoot to fetch water or gather eggs, and women prepared breakfast, kneading dough and tending the hearth. Men went out to the fields, pruned orchards, repaired fences, or worked in shops. Life maintained its ordinary rhythm, as it had for generations. Yet, beneath this familiar monotony, a sense of tension had been building for years, layer upon layer, until it had become nearly tangible. Ordinary citizens had been watching, listening, and preparing without much fanfare. Farmers had drilled with muskets in fields after their daily work. Women had baked bread with local grains and spun homespun cloth. quietly refusing imported goods. Children had learned through observation and play the rhythms of resistance. Mock formations, pretend councils, and covert deliveries of messages. And now, after years of simmering discontent, the inevitable confrontation began in ways that were both shocking and startlingly ordinary. The alarms spread quietly at first. On April 18th, messengers rode through villages, their horses' hooves striking the stones of the road, carrying urgent word that British troops were moving toward Concord to seize weapons and ammunition stored by local militias. Families paused mid-task, a mother scraping potatoes, a child carrying water to the livestock, a man sharpening a plowshare. Conversations turned from mundane concerns to urgent speculation. Will they come this way? Are the men ready? Do we have enough warning to protect what's ours? The ordinary routines of daily life suddenly collided with the extraordinary urgency of imminent conflict. By nightfall, the network of ordinary people had begun to mobilize. Men who had been drilling in fields now carried muskets from hidden barns, checking flints, powder, and shot. Women packed provisions, ensured that children were safe, and quietly reminded neighbors to remain vigilant. Even those who had previously avoided political matters found themselves swept up in the collective preparation. The extraordinary had intruded upon the mundane, and the mundane had become part of the extraordinary. The following morning, April 19, 1775, arrived with deceptive calm. The sun rose over towns dusted with frost, fields gleaming with morning dew, and streets empty save for the occasional messenger or neighbor. Children still fetched water and tended chores. Women still carried out the daily labor that made survival possible. Men, however, moved with purpose, assembling in small groups, comparing notes, and taking positions along the roads leading to Lexington and Concord. The ordinary routines of life, tending animals, preparing tools, preparing food, continued. Yet each task was imbued with the weight of anticipation and the potential for violence. At Lexington Green, the confrontation began quietly, almost as if it were another ordinary day interrupted by an unexpected disturbance. The militia, ordinary men from farms and workshops, faced soldiers in red coats. Both sides were tense, wary, and uncertain. Orders were unclear, commands shouted, and muskets raised. Shots were fired, though it remains a subject of debate which side fired first. 5 men fell dead or mortally wounded, and the rest scattered. For ordinary witnesses, it was not a battle in the grand sense, but a shocking disruption of everyday life. Farmers who had moments before been plowing fields, shopkeepers who had been arranging goods, and families who had been preparing breakfast now faced the immediate and horrifying reality of bloodshed. News of the skirmish spread like wildfire, though slowly by modern standards. Messengers, neighbors, and travelers carried accounts to nearby towns, each retelling slightly altered, but conveying the sense that life as it had been known was over, at least temporarily. Ordinary people, previously accustomed to repetitive routines, now realized that they were participants in events that would alter the trajectory of their lives forever. Mothers, fathers, and children processed the news in kitchens, barns, and workshops, struggling to reconcile the shocking violence with the mundane details of daily existence. The march toward Concord was a tense affair. Ordinary men, having fled from Lexington, regrouped along the route, reinforced by neighbors and friends. Women followed at a discreet distance, carrying water, supplies, or messages. Children watched from behind fences, their eyes wide with fear and fascination, seeing for the first time that the abstract notions of liberty and resistance they had heard about at hearths and in taverns had immediate, tangible consequences. Ordinary life, fields, barns, homes, and streets, had become the theater of conflict. The skirmishes at Concord further illustrated the blending of ordinary and extraordinary. Men who had spent decades as farmers, blacksmiths, carpenters, and laborers now engaged in armed resistance, firing from behind stone walls and fences. The soldiers, trained and disciplined, encountered unexpected resistance from people who were not professional fighters, but who knew their terrain intimately. Every shot fired, every step taken, was laden with the weight of survival, community, and the desire to assert autonomy over one's home and land. In towns surrounding the main roads, ordinary life continued in muted form. Families closed doors and windows, watched the movement of troops from safe distances, and whispered anxiously. Children, while shielded from the immediate violence, observed and absorbed the tension, learning through proximity what years of preparation and subtle resistance had led to. Women tended to the sick or wounded, cooked for neighbors involved in the skirmishes, and maintained homes under conditions of stress previously unimaginable. Throughout the colonies, ordinary people were forced to reconcile the repetitive patterns of life with sudden, violent disruption. A farmer still had fields to tend, a woman still had meals to prepare, and a child still needed clothing and care. Yet, the presence of armed conflict, news of casualties, and the awareness of a broader struggle transformed the perception of everyday life. Ordinary tasks became acts of resilience, survival, and, in subtle ways, continued resistance. The rhythm of daily existence persisted, even as its meaning shifted dramatically. The aftermath of Lexington and Concord left ordinary citizens grappling with uncertainty. Soldiers returned to barracks, while local militias consolidated their positions. Families mourned quietly, tending to the wounded, burying the dead, and maintaining what semblance of routine they could. Children tried to understand why neighbors or family members had been injured or killed. Women wondered how to feed and protect households disrupted by events they could barely comprehend. And men reflected on their roles, uncertain how far their involvement should extend. Even as fighting escalated in small pockets, life carried on in its ordinary patterns. Fields required planting, animals demanded care, and households needed constant attention. And yet, every task was now overlaid with new significance. A plowshare might become a shield, a basket of food might sustain those defending a community, and a pair of boots might be the difference for a man marching miles to join the militia. The ordinary and extraordinary had merged, and daily existence was inseparable from the larger conflict now enveloping the colonies. Communication networks accelerated. Messages detailing troop movements, militia actions, and local skirmishes spread from town to town, ensuring that even remote communities felt the weight of unfolding events. Committees of correspondence coordinated responses, advised on militia readiness, and shared practical strategies for both defense and survival. Ordinary men, women, and children became part of this information web, contributing in ways small and large, carrying notes, supplying provisions, or providing shelter to travelers and messengers. By mid-1775, ordinary life had been irrevocably altered. Children, women, and men, who had once known only routine and repetition, now navigated a reality in which their daily actions intersected directly with the broader struggle for liberty. The boring patterns of domestic labor, fieldwork, and community maintenance were now intertwined with the processes of resistance and survival. Every chore, every meal prepared, every animal tended, every conversation held by the hearth was imbued with the significance of a world in the midst of transformation. Though the extraordinary events of armed conflict had arrived, they did not erase the ordinary. Fields were still plowed, fires were still lit, bread was still baked, and children were still fed and clothed. Yet the ordinary had become extraordinary simply by its persistence amid turmoil. The repetitive rhythms of life, maintained in the shadow of violence, became a testimony to the endurance, adaptability, and quiet courage of ordinary people. The colonies were no longer waiting for history to happen. They were living it in every mundane detail of their existence. The storm that had been quietly building for decades had finally arrived, and ordinary lives were its stage. The first shots had been fired, but the work of resistance, survival, and participation in the unfolding revolution continued quietly, steadfastly, and relentlessly, in kitchens, barns, fields, and homes across the land. After the skirmishes at Lexington and Concord, ordinary life across the colonies became a strange mixture of continuity and upheaval. The sun still rose over farms and villages, roosters still crowed, and children still scrambled out of beds to fetch water, gather eggs, and assist with morning chores. Women continued to grind corn, knead dough, spin wool, and tend fires. Men plowed fields, repaired fences, cared for livestock, and hammered in workshops. To a casual observer, nothing had changed. And yet, beneath the surface, everything had shifted. The first shots fired in April 1775 had made the ordinary extraordinary. News traveled slowly to distant towns, carried by messengers on horseback, travelers in wagons, or neighbors passing letters from one community to another. Even the most remote farmers, who had spent decades working in relative isolation, became aware of the larger conflict enveloping the colonies. Ordinary citizens, who had once measured their days by the rising and setting sun, now measured them by reports of troop movements, militia assembly points, and the status of local stores of arms and ammunition. Every conversation, every errand, every chore was overlaid with awareness of the ongoing struggle. Ordinary people's participation in the war effort, even before formal battles became widespread, was subtle yet essential. Women baked bread not only for their families, but for militiamen who might pass through town. They sewed clothes, mended shoes, and prepared beds for travelers carrying news of skirmishes. Men who had once spent their days in fields and workshops now carried muskets, trained with local militias, or patrolled roads near towns and villages. Children helped carry messages, delivered small supplies, and observed the strategies of adults, learning the rhythms of civic and military life almost by osmosis. The Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia, provided coordination for the colonies, but ordinary people were the engine through which its directives took effect. Committees of correspondence ensured that news, strategies, and instructions reached the smallest settlements. Ordinary households became nodes in a vast, informal network of communication, resistance, and preparation. Families that had never interacted directly with representatives of distant assemblies now found themselves acting on their guidance, often without fully understanding the broader political context. Each act, preparing a musket, carrying flour, refusing taxed goods, was an ordinary act with extraordinary implications. Meanwhile, life's relentless demands persisted. Fields still required planting and weeding. Livestock needed feeding, milking, and care. Homes required maintenance, and illness, injury, and weather continued to challenge families. Ordinary people had to balance the immediate necessity of survival with the emerging responsibilities of supporting a broader resistance. The two were inseparable. A man could not abandon his field because he had to respond to militia orders, and yet he could not ignore the militia because his survival and community depended on readiness and collective action. As the weeks passed, militia companies multiplied in towns and villages. Men who had drilled informally after work now trained more rigorously, often under the guidance of officers who had some military experience. Even in remote areas, communities held drills, stockpiled supplies, and organized watches. Ordinary life was maintained, but it had transformed into a continuous rehearsal for potential conflict. Children observed and imitated these drills in their play. Girls learned to manage supplies, prepare meals for travelers or militia members, and carry messages discreetly. Their education was practical, grounded in the rhythms of survival and participation, and informed by the growing reality of war. The presence of British troops, though often distant, affected ordinary routines as well. Farmers noticed redcoats moving along roads. Merchants tracked shipments to avoid interception, and families discussed how best to shelter children or livestock in case of raids. Even the quietest village now contained the undercurrent of vigilance. Ordinary life was never the same again, because the ordinary now existed in tension with danger, with awareness that the stability of daily existence was contingent upon both preparation and caution. Food, clothing, and shelter became intertwined with political action. Families carefully rationed supplies, not only for survival, but to support militiamen passing through. Women baked, churned butter, and brewed herbs with an eye toward helping neighbors involved in the war effort. Men delivered supplies, repaired weapons, and monitored the movements of friends and foes alike. Children, while continuing their chores, carried messages, fetched tools, and learned through observation the subtle codes of responsibility, loyalty, and resilience. The ordinary had become a crucible for the extraordinary. Even as battles began to spread beyond Massachusetts into New York, New Jersey, and Virginia, ordinary life continued to impose its demands. Fields could not wait for troops, animals could not pause their grazing, and households required attention. The rhythm of labor persisted, now embedded with urgency and political significance. The extraordinary events of rebellion existed alongside, and often within, the mundane details of survival. A mother mending clothes while listening to the distant sound of musket fire, a child fetching water while hearing word of a nearby skirmish, a farmer plowing a field while contemplating militia strategy. All were ordinary acts, yet they had become part of history in motion. News of the Battle of Bunker Hill, though occurring months later in June 1775, traveled slowly to outlying communities. Ordinary citizens read, heard, and discussed accounts in homes, taverns, and meeting houses. The courage, suffering, and deaths of those involved became part of local storytelling, shaping collective understanding of what resistance could require. Families absorbed the lessons silently, integrating them into their routines and using the knowledge to prepare further for both defense and survival. The colonies were entering a new phase. Ordinary life, cooking, cleaning, farming, spinning, mending, tending animals, had become inseparable from the broader revolutionary struggle. Each act of survival, each choice made in daily labor, was part of a pattern of collective action. The so-called boring life of the average colonist was now the backbone of a war effort, sustaining militias, maintaining communities, and embedding the principles of resistance into the very fabric of society. By the fall of 1775, the reality of war was undeniable. Soldiers marched regularly, militias engaged in skirmishes, and communities learned to live under the constant awareness of danger and responsibility. Ordinary people had adapted to this dual existence, balancing daily labor with participation in resistance. Children had matured in their understanding of duty. Women had expanded their roles in support and coordination, and men had become disciplined not only in trade, but in militia service. And yet, despite all the upheaval, the rhythm of ordinary life persisted. Fields continued to be plowed, bread continued to be baked, fires continued to burn in hearths, and children continued to grow and learn. The extraordinary was embedded within the ordinary, and ordinary life had become extraordinary simply by enduring and participating. Every chore, every meal prepared, every field tilled, every letter sent, and every conversation held by the hearth contributed to the ongoing struggle, creating a web of resilience, awareness, and quiet determination. Ordinary life had become a stage upon which history played out, unremarkable in appearance, but immense in consequence. The patterns of survival and work, repeated day after day, were now inseparable from the unfolding story of rebellion. And while the first shots had been fired months before, the full scope of revolution was only beginning to be experienced by those whose days were still measured by chores, sunlight, and the demands of living. The ordinary had carried the extraordinary forward, and by now, It was clear that the rhythm of life itself, the persistent, unglamorous, repetitive acts of labor, care, and communication, was what made the colonies capable of sustaining a fight that would shape history. By the early months of 1776, life in the American colonies had settled into a strange, persistent rhythm where the ordinary and extraordinary had fused into a single, inescapable experience. Dawn still arrived with the crowing of roosters, sunlight glinting off fields and rooftops, and children still awoke to fetch water, gather eggs, or assist with early chores. Women still kindled fires, kneaded dough, churned butter, tended vegetables, and spun wool. Men still repaired fences, worked the fields, cared for livestock, and tended workshops. Yet beneath these seemingly mundane tasks lay the accumulated weight of years of preparation, resistance, and confrontation, the ordinary now inseparable from the extraordinary. The early battles of the Revolution, Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill, had transformed the landscape of daily existence. News of skirmishes and casualties moved slowly through communities, carried by horseback messengers, travelers, and letters. Families that had once measured their lives by the changing seasons now measured them in militia movements, troop sightings, and the arrival of letters from committees of correspondence. Ordinary routines, baking bread, milking cows, repairing roofs, persisted. But every act was now charged with awareness of the larger struggle unfolding across towns, villages, and fields. Militias had become a fixture of daily life. Men who had labored for decades as farmers, carpenters, blacksmiths, and tradesmen now carried muskets and drilled with determination, often after completing their work in fields or workshops. Practices became more disciplined, formations more precise, and strategies subtly woven into familiar landscapes. Children watched closely, mimicking these movements in play, while women coordinated supplies, prepared provisions, and maintained households in a manner that supported both survival and resistance. Each member of the community, from the youngest child to the eldest elder, had a role that was simultaneously ordinary and crucial. Communication networks had matured, though still slow by modern standards. Letters detailing troop movements, militia orders, and the locations of stored weapons traveled from town to town, connecting isolated farms and villages into a web of shared knowledge and coordinated response. Ordinary citizens participated in this network, carrying messages, observing the movements of neighbors, preparing food or bedding for traveling militias. Even seemingly mundane interactions, sharing tools, exchanging clothing, or delivering bread, had significance beyond immediate necessity. Ordinary life itself had become a mechanism of collective action. Daily labor continued, though always overshadowed by awareness of potential danger. Fields had to be plowed, livestock fed, barns repaired, and homes maintained, even as militia members prepared for engagement, soldiers patrolled, and neighbors communicated urgent news. The ordinary demands of life and the extraordinary demands of a revolution coexisted, inseparably intertwined. Every chore became an act of endurance, every meal an act of support, and every observation an act of vigilance. Children absorbed this rhythm intuitively, learning through play and observation the subtle rules of survival, responsibility, and civic engagement. Women, often overlooked in historical narratives, played a critical role. They baked, spun, and churned not only to sustain their families but to support militias and communities. They carried water to travelers, patched clothing, and coordinated household resources to ensure that even in the face of disruption, daily life continued. Their labor, previously regarded as ordinary domestic work, now formed the backbone of resilience and resistance, demonstrating that the mundane could be revolutionary. The presence of British troops, though concentrated in urban centers and strategic towns, affected ordinary life far and wide. Farmers and artisans monitored redcoat movements, coordinated with neighbors, and ensured that local militias remained informed and prepared. Children noticed soldiers on distant roads, drums and boots echoing across familiar landscapes. Conversations at hearths, in taverns, and along fences increasingly revolved around strategy, caution, and awareness. Ordinary routines, feeding animals, repairing homes, tending crops, became intertwined with subtle preparation for engagement, making every action potentially significant. Despite the tension, the ordinary persisted. Fields required tending, homes demanded care, and children still played in ways that were both ordinary and educational. Families continued to perform essential tasks: chopping firewood, mending clothing, preparing meals, and caring for the sick or elderly. Yet these tasks were now colored by context. A loaf of bread might sustain a passing militia. A repaired fence might conceal weapons. A basket of supplies might be delivered to a neighbor preparing for engagement. Life's monotony had become a scaffold for extraordinary endurance and participation. By mid-1776, the Continental Congress was moving toward the Declaration of Independence, and word of its deliberations filtered slowly into the colonies. Ordinary people heard rumors, read letters aloud, and discussed the implications in quiet conversation. Though few understood the full legal or philosophical details, the significance was clear. The colonies were asserting autonomy, and ordinary citizens were central to the endeavor. Each small act, carrying messages, tending livestock, cooking, mending clothing, was a thread in the fabric of rebellion, unremarkable in appearance, yet critical in function. Communities adapted to sustain this dual existence. Militia training occurred alongside planting and harvesting. Provisioning for soldiers occurred in parallel with household chores. Ordinary routines were never abandoned. They were repurposed and layered with new significance. Children observed and participated wherever appropriate, gaining practical knowledge of strategy, endurance, and the interconnectedness of work and responsibility. Each day became both an ordinary sequence of tasks and a rehearsal for broader participation in an unfolding revolution. The autumn of 1776 brought increased engagement with actual military operations, but even in the midst of battles and marches, ordinary life persisted. Fields continued to be plowed, homes continued to be maintained, and daily chores continued, interspersed with vigilance and preparation. Families adapted, women managed households while supporting local militias, men alternated between labor and defense, and children assisted wherever needed, all under the constant awareness that life could change suddenly. The ordinary was now inseparable from the extraordinary. Communication and coordination intensified. Ordinary citizens carried letters and intelligence across long distances, maintained safe houses for travelers and messengers, and ensured that local militias remained informed. Routine activities, feeding animals, mending clothes, repairing tools, tending gardens, intersected with the broader effort of sustaining community and resistance. Survival, resistance, and daily labor had become intertwined to a degree never experienced before. By winter 1776, the colonies faced harsh conditions. Cold, snow, and scarcity compounded the ongoing conflict. Families struggled to keep warm, feed livestock, and maintain health. Yet, ordinary life, preparing meals, tending fires, spinning wool, and tending children, continued with remarkable persistence. Even the smallest acts were now politically and strategically significant. A repaired roof protected families and supplies. A baked loaf fed a soldier. A message delivered by a child carried intelligence crucial for local planning. The ordinary had become revolutionary in both its endurance and its function. As the year progressed, ordinary life and revolutionary action coalesced into a sustained rhythm. Daily survival, labor, and care were inseparable from vigilance, preparation, and participation in the struggle for independence. Communities learned to function with resilience, balancing mundane needs with extraordinary circumstances. Children matured within this environment, learning not only practical skills, but also awareness of civic responsibility and communal effort. Women's labor continued to sustain families and militias alike, while men's work alternated between survival and defense. Every household, every field, every workshop had become a microcosm of the broader revolution. By the end of 1776, the colonies had transformed. Ordinary life, the rhythms of work, survival, and domestic care, had become the foundation upon which the extraordinary events of revolution were built. Every plowed field, baked loaf, repaired barn, and tended child contributed to resilience, coordination, and eventual victory. The repetitive, mundane acts of daily life had woven themselves into history, demonstrating that the persistence of ordinary people, even in the most unremarkable tasks, was indispensable to the birth of a nation. And so, the story of these years closes not with dramatic spectacle, but with enduring ordinary life, resilient in the face of disruption, persistent in the rhythms of survival, and quietly revolutionary in its significance. The colonies, and the people within them, had sustained themselves through monotony, preparation, and subtle acts of resistance. Life continued. Fields were tilled, fires were tended, meals were prepared, and children grew. Yet every ordinary act carried extraordinary weight, shaping a future that would be remembered, though often unnoticed in its day-to-day unfolding. The ordinary had become the extraordinary, and through it, the story of a nation was quietly, steadily, and inevitably written.